Ladies and gentlemen, courtesy of Stuart K. Hayashi, the folly of ceding the word selfishness to its enemies. He writes me a letter, and he wrote me this letter, and I replied and said I'd really like to read this in a video. And so then he revised it just a bit and sent it to me and said, now it's ready, go ahead and read this version. So here we have it, a ringing defense of selfishness as the word that we need to stand on and defend as virtue. By the way, his screen name is Legendre007. So any hate mail, for this can just be directed to him. I think it can fairly be said that an entrepreneur lives by a benevolent form of selfishness. He is trying to profit himself and serve his own interests, and that technically is selfish. Of course, his entrepreneurship doesn't necessarily harm anyone. In fact, other people benefit from it. Herein lies the problem. The word selfishness, in its traditional usage, has two meanings. The technical definition is looking out for one's own self-interest, which technically applies to the harmless entrepreneur. The word's second meaning is in its emotional underpinnings. The assumption is that selfishness entails harming other people for one's own gain. The word is thereby used as a synonym for evil. Now, isn't that interesting? You need to find a word that implies that every time it's present, evil is present. Is that not a synonym of evil? Are we going to let that happen? Murderers like Charles Manson are considered selfish in that other sense. The equivocation of selfishness with the harming of others arises from this false assumption that there are only two alternatives. One can sacrifice oneself for the benefit of others, or one can harm others for the benefit of oneself. That false dichotomy allows no room for that other option, serving one's own happiness without injury to others. That third option is just ignored when you treat the word selfishness the way that they do. But continuing, anti-capitalists take advantage of this. They note that entrepreneurs are technically selfish in that they are promoting their own self-interest. Then anti-capitalists cast the label of selfish upon entrepreneurs in the hope that all of the negative connotations of that second, more latent meaning, victimizing other people, as Manson and Al Capone did, will stick to these harmless entrepreneurs. And it succeeds. The idea is to create the impression that harmless entrepreneurs engage in an evil that is not completely unlike that of murderers, like Attila the Hun and Charles Manson. Ayn Rand combated this prejudice by pointing out that entrepreneurs practice a form of self-interest in which they do not brutalize other people. And she emphasized that this is a virtuous selfishness. She purposefully defended her own ethical views about entrepreneurship as selfishness, because she wanted to undermine and expose the pernicious psychological equivocations that are present in the so-called progressives' denunciations of business people as selfish. So Ayn Rand purposefully took a stand on the word selfish because of the attacks against it and who they were labeling as selfish. The people being labeled as selfish, Ayn Rand saw, are in dire need of defense. They are some of the best people history has ever had. Quote, I have heard some people say that they overall agree with Ayn Rand's perspective, but they don't like how she proudly uses the word selfishness with this new, better, pro-entrepreneurship, pro-profit definition. They say that if I announce that I believe in the virtue of selfishness, people will immediately become offended, right? We don't want to offend people. They'll be offended by that word and then close their minds against my case without giving it a fair hearing. They suggest defending the entrepreneur's rightful self-interest while avoiding the use of that explosive trigger word selfishness. So, guess what? Some people who have actually written books subscribe to that viewpoint. And we go now, is that a prudent approach? I have asked myself that question over the past few months. I considered the following line of thought. The correct definition of a word is determined by the mainstream of the culture that uses that word. Therefore, if the cultural mainstream accepts harming other people for one's own gain as the only correct definition of selfishness, then you just have to concede that the common definition of selfishness is the only true one already. That's it. Stop embarrassing yourself by insisting on using selfishness in such an idiosyncratic manner. That was his thought. I have come to reject that proposition, since that approach is somewhat Orwellian. In the novel 1984, the character of O'Brien, an agent of Big Brother's totalitarian regime, explains that Big Brother tries to control which words people can and cannot use. You need certain words with certain definitions to debate against Big Brother's propaganda. You ceded to Big Brother the authority to tell you which words you may use, or how you may employ and or define a word. Then, if you do this, then you are ceding to Big Brother the authority to dictate the very terms of the debate. So, if selfishness is a synonym of evil and we just allow them to keep that word and we try to equivocate on some other grounds, they're setting the terms. Why should they set the terms? And you're letting Big Brother rig the rules of the debate against you. The principle doesn't change if we replace Big Brother with mainstream culture. So just do that whole paragraph again and say, if we allow mainstream culture to set this, if we do this, if you cede to mainstream culture the authority to tell you which words you may use, etc., etc. Mainstream culture can't be the authority any more than Big Brother. What the hell is that? To say most people or 99% of people understand selfishness to be this or that. So what? So what? Big Brother understands it to be this or that. So what? What is it? Suppose your case requires that you expose the manner in which Big Brother's propaganda employs anti-concepts and the fallacy of the stolen concept. Then Big Brother tells you that you're not allowed to say anti-concept, stolen concept, or any synonym for these expressions. If you acquiesce to Big Brother here, then how are you going to explain to people that Big Brother employs anti-concepts and stolen concepts? Either you can't, or you've allowed Big Brother to unfairly make it more difficult for you to make your case. You're going to have to find some other way to do it, or it's not going to be possible. Just like if you take the word selfishness away, it's not going to be possible to make this case. If we won't use the word selfish, if we stay away from it hands off, because we grant validity to their usage of that, if we grant validity to their usage of that, and then go ahead and try to make our case for capitalism, freedom, rights, we will be seen as the despicable, contradictory, measly, compromising, cowering lot that we would have to be seen as if we're going to cede that sort of ground. When you have an innovative philosophic insight, explaining that new insight sometimes requires that you invent a new word, or use an old word with a new connotation, and explain why the new connotation can be applied to that old word. To explain some new insights, you often have to use a few words in a way that is still unfamiliar, and even outlandish to most people. Einstein had to do a few interesting things when he brought relativity on the scene. Everyone knows about that. But did you know that Galileo and Newton had to do interesting things? Like Newton, when he came on the scene, velocity and mass and stuff had different meanings and stuff. But Newton was able to he would say there's a difference between the weight and the mass. The weight is dependent on the gravitational effect of nearby objects. The mass is not. So the mass remains what it is in outer space, even if you can't put it on a scale in outer space. It weighs nothing in outer space, but it has mass. Gravity is relative to the body you're on, is a different conception from in Newton than all previous notions. He took the notion that previously was corrupted by all kinds of silliness. He concretized it and said, look, here's a definition from reality of what this word would have to mean. And we've stuck with that ever since. It's our scientific understanding of mass. So at some point, words that someone has tried to form this concept, but they have got things mixed up in it somehow. And at some point, a scientist in that field has to come along and say, no, you can't put these extra things in there. And they have to make a good case, as Ayn Rand has made, and then they can set down the real objective definition of the word that we're after. We want the word selfish, and all kinds of things have been packed with it. But we've discovered that those things are packed with it artificially in a package deal. Continuing.